Snow had begun falling long before dawn, drifting down the mountains like white ash from an invisible fire. In Black Ridge Hollow, winter did not simply arrive. It conquered. It pushed into the bones, stiffened the lungs, and wrapped itself around every cabin, until even the wood groaned in surrender. Elias Boone had lived in these mountains his whole life, but each winter still felt like another battle he was destined to lose. He left the coal mine that evening long after the whistle blew. His shift had ended early, but he stayed behind, swinging his pick at a worthless vein until his arms burned. It was the only way he knew to silence the ache inside him, the ache that had lived there since the day his wife, Clara, left this world 8 winters ago. Her memory clung to him like coal dust, stubborn and impossible to wipe clean. When he finally emerged from the dark mouth of the mine, the world was dim, quiet, and breathless. Snow drifted thickly, making the lantern on the post flicker like it was shivering. Elias pulled his coat tight and started toward the road that led down to his cabin. His boots crushed snow over the frozen mud, and each step sounded like a small, lonely echo in the woods. He didn't expect to find anyone on the mountain trail, certainly not in this weather, but halfway down the ridge, something made him stop. A faint cry, thin, almost swallowed by the wind. Elias turned, listening. Another cry came, fuller this time, trembling. A child. He hurried toward the sound, pushing aside low branches heavy with snow. Then he saw it. A small shape curled against a fallen tree, covered in a blanket already stiffening with frost. A boy no older than 6. Beside him, half buried by snow, a woman. Her hair was tangled with ice, her face pale beneath the storm's bite, her arms wrapped tightly around the child as if shielding him from the whole cruel world. "Hey!" Elias knelt, brushing snow away from her face. "Ma'am, can you hear me?" Her eyelids fluttered, but she didn't answer. The boy stirred, clutching her coat. "Ma?" His voice cracked, thin with cold. Elias checked the woman's breath. Faint, but still there. He scooped the boy into his arms first, then lifted the woman as gently as he could. Her weight was nothing. She felt like a ghost he was trying to carry back into life. He moved quickly, boots sliding on ice, snow whipping into his eyes. By the time he reached his cabin, his breath came in ragged bursts. He kicked the door open with his shoulder. Inside, the cabin glowed with amber firelight. Hattie, his 8-year-old daughter, jumped up from the rocking chair where she'd been sewing doll clothes.
Pa? Who?
"Blankets," Elias said, breathless. "Quick." Hattie ran. She returned with quilts, spreading them on the bed near the stove. Elias laid the woman down, then wrapped the boy tightly. The child clung to him, shaking. "We got lost," the boy whispered. "Mama said we'd find town, but she fell." "What's your name, son?"
Jimmy?
"All right, Jimmy," Elias said, lowering his voice. "You're safe now. Your mama, too." Hattie brought more quilts, pressing them around the woman's shoulders. She watched Elias with those sharp, observant eyes she inherited from Clara. Eyes that saw more than she ever said. "Pa," she whispered, "is she gonna die?" "No." Elias spoke with a certainty he didn't feel. "Not tonight." He moved to the stove, grabbing kindling, coaxing flame into a roar. Winter tried to invade the cabin every year, but Elias never lost a fight with fire. Hattie helped him, placing pots of water to warm. The woman's chest rose shallowly. Her lips trembled, her breath uneven. Elias checked her pulse again and again, each time fearing it might disappear under his fingers. After nearly an hour, she stirred. Her voice cracked like dry wood. "Jimmy?" The boy scrambled to her side. "Ma, I'm here. I'm right here." Elias poured warm water into a tin cup and lifted her head gently so she could sip. "What were you doing out in a storm like this?" Elias asked. She swallowed hard, throat raw. "We came from the rail camp. North side. He said he'd be back. He never came." "Who?" "My husband." Her eyes flickered with something. Fear, grief, exhaustion so deep it carved shadows beneath her skin. "He was drinking again. He gets mean when the bottle's empty." Elias exchanged a glance with Hattie. The girl's face softened with worry. "What's your name, ma'am?" he asked quietly. She hesitated, as if saying it might break something fragile inside her. "Margaret," she whispered.
Margaret Hale.
Elias nodded slowly. Well, Margaret, my name's Elias Boone. This here's my daughter, Hattie. You'll stay here tonight. Storm's getting worse. No, Margaret rasped. We don't want trouble. Folks don't take kindly to strangers wandering into town. They don't take kindly to much of anything, Elias muttered. But you're staying. You walk back out there, you die. Margaret closed her eyes, exhaustion settling over her like fresh snow. Jimmy curled beside her, burying his face into her shoulder. For a long time the cabin was quiet except for the crackle of fire. Then Hattie tugged Elias's sleeve. Pa, can I give Jimmy my quilt? The one with the red squares? Elias looked down at her. Small, brave, carrying more kindness in her bones than the whole town combined. Yeah, he murmured. I think you should. She placed the quilt over Jimmy with almost sacred care. The boy blinked at her, surprised by the softness of it, by the softness of her face. Elias watched them, something shifting inside him. Something he hadn't felt in years, a warmth that wasn't from the stove. When Margaret finally fell asleep, Elias stepped outside onto the porch. The wind cut across his face like icy fingers, but he needed the air, needed to think. Strangers? A woman? A child? In his home. Black Ridge Hollow would talk. The church ladies would sharpen their tongues. The men at the mine would glare. Reputation mattered more than blood in this town. But the thought of sending Margaret back into that storm felt like a sin. No preacher could ever forgive. Hattie stepped out beside him, small and barefoot, her blanket wrapped around her shoulders. Pa, she said softly, they're just like us. Elias swallowed. How you figure? They're cold. They're tired. They lost somebody. Her voice wavered. Like we lost Ma. Elias looked down at her. The only reason he kept breathing some days. Inside the cabin, Margaret stirred again, shivering even under the quilts. Jimmy curled closer to her, seeking safety. Hattie leaned her head against Elias's arm. Can they stay? For Christmas? She whispered. It was 3 days away. Snow swirled across the porch, settling on Elias's boots. He looked up at the mountains. Dark, towering, silent witnesses. He'd been alone a long time. Too long. We'll see, he murmured. We'll see what tomorrow brings. But even as he said it, he felt something shift. A door inside him he'd kept locked since Clara died. And now it stood open, letting in a cold December night. And something warmer, something dangerously close to hope. They slept late the next morning, as if the storm had taken their urgency and left them, blanketed in a kind of fragile peace. When light leaked through the shutters, it painted the room in a pale gold that made every speck of coal dust glimmer like a memory. Hattie was up first, already at the stove, mending the small holes in the boy's cap while humming a tune she had learned from her mother. Elias watched from the doorway, coffee in his hands, the steam forming a small cloud that vanished quickly in the chill. Margaret sat propped against pillows, her hair tamed into a loose knot by Hattie's quick fingers. Jimmy played with a wooden soldier Hattie had carved. The soldier's paint long since flaked away. The child's laugh was soft but steady, a sound that melted the last stubborn traces of Elias's grief as surely as sunlight melted frost. Eat, Elias said, setting a plate before Margaret. You need strength. She accepted it with a small, grateful nod. Thank you, she whispered, and for a moment the words were like a hymn in the quiet room. Word moved through Black Ridge Hollow slowly, the way smoke curls from a chimney and finds its way into every room. It began at the mine, a whisper from a man who'd seen Elias carry a shivering boy off the mountain 2 nights prior. It drifted through the general store on Mrs. Pritchard's breath, then into the pews on Sunday, then along the boards outside the post office. By afternoon it had settled into corners and window sills and found its way to the women who met every Tuesday to sew and gossip. The first reactions were small and precise. Mrs. Keene, who ran the bakery, left a small loaf by Elias's door with no note. Jeb, who trapped near the hollow, stopped by to trade a rabbit for a jar of preserves, and tipped his hat in a way he never would have before. These were gestures of neighborliness, the kind townsfolk offered when they wanted to keep their hands clean and their consciences tidy. But other movements were colder and harder to ignore. At the cart in front of the mercantile, a group of men spoke low, and then turned their backs when Elias approached. The butcher raised his voice and cut him short, citing debts unpaid, though Elias had always paid on time. A woman at the well let a bucket slip from her hands and spill water when Hattie came to draw for the stove. It was as if caution had grown teeth. Elias felt it all like a wind that picked up and buffeted the cabin, but he kept his eyes on the ones who needed him. Margaret did small things around the kitchen. She cleaned pots without being asked, set plates with a care that made Hattie beam, and formed a patient calm around the children that drew them like moths to a lantern. There was an economy in her kindness, born of necessity and the careful management of hope. "You don't have to stay if it's—" She began one evening as the sun sank behind the ridge and threw long, blue shadows across the yard. Elias sat on the steps, hands blackened from chopping wood. He looked at her, and for a long second did not answer. The truth was a weight he had kept pinned to the floor like a stubborn plank. He had thought of it in the dark hours, when Clara's voice felt like a hand on his shoulder, and then slipped away. He had known that opening his door had consequences, but he had not known the price until the town began to count it. "We'll manage," he said finally. "You and the young'un, you'll manage. If you don't want the trouble, we'll—" "No." Margaret's face set with a determination Elias had seen before in miners' wives and midwives, the kind of grit that would not be polished away by gossip. "I won't be the reason a child goes without bread." Hattie, listening from the doorway, crossed her arms. "You're not the reason," she insisted. "Papa's the reason he has a house now." It was Hattie's certainty that cut through the worry, like light through a cloud. She moved closer to her father and rested her head on his shoulder. And for the first time since Clara's funeral, Elias allowed himself to believe that perhaps the world could be different. Days folded into one another, the small rhythms of a household learning to fit together. Elias took to waking earlier. The cold no longer a complaint, but the way the morning felt. He would stoke the stove and sit with a cup of coffee while the children tumbled around the kitchen. Margaret put out jars of stewed apples, and Hattie polished the hearth until it gleamed like a promise. One afternoon, when the sun was a brittle coin in the sky, Elias took Margaret into town to trade for nails and a few yards of cloth. The mine had started him on a small run of work repairing fences for neighbors, and he used the few dollars he had saved to exchange for the things the household needed. Walking behind him, Margaret held Jimmy's hand tightly, his small mittened hand warm against her knuckles. Elias felt the townsfolk's eyes on them as they passed, and in each glance he read a judgment that had nothing to do with Margaret's worth and everything to do with the fear people felt when their comfortable conventions were disturbed. They stopped at the mercantile. Warren Larkin, who kept the ledger and judged credit, looked up from his counter when Elias entered, then quickly averted his eyes when he saw who accompanied him. "Morning, Mr. Boone," Warren said. The words were polite enough, but there was a brittle edge to them that Elias did not miss. "We need small things," Elias said. "Nails, some twine, and a length of calico, if you have it." Warren's hands moved with practiced civility. "I'll get them for you." He turned and disappeared into the back room. He returned with a measured bundle, his fingers barely touching Elias's coin. He offered no smile. When they stepped back into the sunlight, a group of women by the post office reduced their conversation to silence. It was the sound of the town closing a door. Elias saw it and steadied himself against the sting that rose in his chest. He had expected this. He had not expected the way it would feel to be treated like an ember about to flame, up and burn someone. At night around the stove, Margaret told of the rail camp in low, even tones. She spoke of the men who worked tracks and slept in bunkhouses, of a husband who could swing between tenderness and fury as quickly as a bell tolls. Her words were not dramatic. They were the kind of small, everyday cruelties that construct a life and can crush it without fanfare. Elias listened, and at times the old anger rose in him, the kind that came when a man saw a wrong and did not have a law to fix it. But there were other men in Black Ridge, hollow, who had guns and ledgers and voices that could drown out any plea for mercy. "Could you find work at the depot?" Elias asked once. "It's not that easy," Margaret replied. "I don't have a skill besides mending and cooking. The depot has no place for a woman alone with a child. They take men who can carry sacks and keep a ledger." "You mend fine," Hattie said. You could mend everyone's coats." Margaret shook her head with a tired smile that did not reach her eyes. "I mended my husband's shirts until he left. Mending is not always the kind of work townsfolk pay for." Hattie's lower lip trembled. "We can sell eggs," she offered. "We'll get chickens." Elias looked at his daughter then, and his throat tightened. Hattie's willingness was a blade. She would give a thing until she had nothing left to give. That was the danger and the grace of a child like her. The days hummed with ordinary tasks and small mercies. They skinned a rabbit together and ate it with new appreciation. Margaret taught Hattie a way to braid corn husks into dolls, and Hattie taught Jimmy how to whittle down a stick into a crude soldier. Elias sat in the doorway some evenings, watching the three of them work like a man, watching someone stitch up a wound and knowing the scar would always be there but might heal clean. Rumors gathered like flurries at the edges of town. Every Tuesday, the sewing group stitched and stitched until even their whispers could be heard like distant thunder. Mrs. Pritchard, who had once left a loaf at Elias's door, began to avoid the noon crowd. She had the sense to measure how long it took for a notion to spread into malice and decided to distance herself before it turned into anything harsher. Others were less discreet. A young woman who'd played with Hattie at school was suddenly told she could no longer visit, the excuse so thin it sounded like the paper it was written on. The church noticed, as churches always do. Reverend Ames kept his sermons hedged in scripture and civility, but there was a line in his voice that suggested a sermon was coming. He had, the congregation whispered, a great responsibility to maintain the order on which the town's morals rested. For some, the presence of a woman and child under Elias Boone's roof seemed a crack in that order. For others, it seemed an opportunity to practice the compassion they preached each Sunday. One chilly afternoon, as blue light sat heavy on the ridge, Reverend Ames came to the cabin. He was not a large man, but his presence carried the sort of gravity that made children fall silent. He entered without a knock, and in his hands he held a small basket of fruit and a frown that wore the edges of other men's approval. "Mr. Boone," he began, setting the basket upon the table as if placing a sentence into the room. "I wish to speak with you about—" Elias gestured to a chair. "Sit, Reverend." Reverend Ames sat, and for a long moment they simply looked at one another, two men shaped by different kinds of burdens. "You did a good thing bringing them in after the storm," the Reverend said carefully. "Charity is a virtue." "We needed warmth and food," Elias answered, plain as a nail. Reverend Ames sighed. "Yet the town has questions. There are those who are concerned with appearances. They worry what example this sets, especially for families with young daughters." Elias felt the old weight settle into his shoulders like a sack of coal. "You mean will Hattie be shunned?" Reverend Ames's eyes softened. "It is more delicate than that, Elias. People fear scandal. They fear that one misstep will lead to many." Elias pushed back a strand of hair. He thought of Clara's steady hands when she had taught Hattie to braid her hair and how she would never have allowed gossip to guide her life. "Scandal or not," he said, his voice low, "I will not send them back into a storm." Reverend Ames seemed to consider the words as if they could be rearranged into a plea. "Then perhaps we must be wise," he said. "There may be a way to help that preserves dignity. A job perhaps in town. A trustworthy place for the child." Elias looked at Margaret then, who knelt by Jimmy and tied his shoelaces, with hands that were both sure and trembling. There was an honesty in the way she did simple tasks, the quiet of someone who had learned not to trust much beyond the next breath. He thought of the way Blackridge Hollow had become a smaller and meaner place in the last few days, easier to judge than to understand. "Find us work," he said at last. "If you can, Reverend. I'll not ask for favors, only for an honest chance." Reverend Ames rose, smoothing his coat as if it could be made perfect by his careful hands. "I will speak," he promised, "but understand this. Not everyone in Blackridge Hollow will see this as you do. Some hearts are harder than old stone." Elias nodded. "I know." As the Reverend stepped out into the light and the wind that scraped at his coat, Elias felt the town's judgment like a chill that would not leave even the warmth of the stove. Yet inside, at the table where the woman mended and the children played, there was a softness that felt more like home than the Hollow ever had. That night Elias lay awake longer than he had in years, listening to the house breathe. He listened to the snore of the stove and the soft murmur of Margaret as she hummed, something he did not recognize, and he let himself imagine. A quilt spread across a larger table, laughter that was not edged with sorrow, a life made of such small, stubborn joys. Outside the ridge held the storm like a memory. Inside, a different kind of weather brewed, one made of courage and small rebellions. The decision to keep a stranger warm, to let a child learn to carol again, to refuse to bargain goodness for approval. In the morning, before the sun even climbed the ridge, Elias rose and walked to the mine. The men there greeted him with nods that were neither warm nor cold. Work was waiting. The unglamorous everyday task that required calloused hands and an honest back. As he swung his pick and let the rhythm of the mine take him, his thoughts returned again and again to the cabin. He had done something that morning that could not be undone. He had let his house become a refuge. The mine was a place of iron and black breath, where men spoke in short sentences and kept their hearts in their pockets. He worked until the light was low and the dust hung in the air like a second sky. When he emerged, he found a note nailed to his door in the dimming light, a scrap of paper with handwriting that made a neat, polite arrangement of anger. It said simply, "A meeting will be held Friday at the hall." No signature, no reason beyond the presence of others who thought themselves entitled to judge. Elias sat on the doorstep with the note in his hands, and the world felt suddenly older, the kind of old that carried stories like scars. He folded the paper with the patience of a man who had learned to endure, and rose. He would attend. He would not be silent. But he knew, with the bones-deep certainty of a man who had picked away at coal seams, that a fissure had opened in Blackridge Hollow, and whether it would widen into ruin or be filled with new mortar depended on those willing to lay it. The Friday meeting felt like a storm waiting behind a shut door. Quiet for now, but swollen with pressure, ready to break the moment someone loosened the first hinge. All morning, Blackridge Hollow moved with a stiff, practiced stillness. Women laid out pies but forgot the sugar. Men sharpened tools they didn't need sharpened. Children were kept inside, because even they could feel the air turning sharp, like winter preparing to bite again. Elias worked in the yard that day, repairing the barn hinge and trimming the splintered ends of the firewood pile. He swung the hatchet with slow, precise strikes, not for the warmth it brought, nor for the chore itself, but because movement helped him breathe. Hattie sensed his silence and kept close, handing him small branches and watching him with a concentration far too heavy for an 8-year-old. Inside, Margaret folded laundry with a methodical calm that did not fool him. The crease in her brow, the stiffness in her hands. She knew something was coming. Anyone who had lived with fear knew the smell of it. By late afternoon, Elias dressed in his clean shirt, the one Clara had sewn years before, and brushed the coal dust from his vest. He looked older in the mirror, not from age, but from the weight of a choice he could no longer undo. Hattie stood in the doorway. "Pa, do you have to go?" "I do," he said. "Will they be mean?" Her eyes were round, her voice small. "Maybe," Elias admitted. "But a man shouldn't hide because others choose to be cruel." Hattie wrapped her arms around him tight. "I'm not scared," she said, though her grip betrayed her words. Margaret stood behind her. "We'll be here when you return," she said quietly. "No matter how late." Elias nodded, touched the doorframe once, a habit he had carried since Clara's death, and stepped outside into the cold. The town hall was already half full when he arrived. Lanterns flickered against the plank walls, casting jittering shadows on faces lined not with fatigue, but with judgment. Men who had worked beside him for 10 years now stood in stiff rows. Women in shawls whispered into gloved hands, their eyes darting toward him as though his presence confirmed their worst fears. At the front table stood 3 men: Warren Larkin, Reverend Ames, and old Mr. Harp, the unofficial, unpaid, unchallenged authority of Blackridge Hollow. These were not men who asked questions. These were men who delivered verdicts. Elias took his seat. A hush settled over the hall, thick and expectant. Warren spoke first. "We're gathered," he said, "to address a concern regarding Mr. Boone's recent behavior and the consequences it brings upon our community. He paused as if expecting Elias to shrink. Elias didn't. Mr. Boone, Warren continued, you've brought an unaccompanied woman and her child into your home, for weeks, without formal arrangement. That is not proper for a man with a young daughter. A murmur rippled through the room. Elias stood slowly. I brought them in because they were freezing on the mountain, he said. I didn't take a vote. I did what was right. Reverend Ames cleared his throat. Right intentions can still lead to— You preach charity every Sunday, Elias cut in, his voice controlled. But the moment charity costs you comfort, suddenly it's improper. Gasps fluttered like moth wings. Mr. Harp stepped forward, cane tapping the floor. This town has order. Son, rules. We built 'em hard so this place could survive. I know those rules, Elias said. I followed them after Clara died. I kept to myself. I minded my work, and all it did was make my home a tomb. The room stiffened at the mention of his late wife. They needed shelter, Elias went on, and they found it in my cabin. That's all. Warren lifted his chin. If it were only about shelter, they'd have gone by now. Where? Elias snapped. You know the depot won't hire a woman alone. The camp is no place for a child. And what of the husband who drank and hit? You want to send them back to that? Silence, uncomfortable, heavy. One woman muttered, She's hiding something. Another whispered, It's improper, plain and simple. Reverend Ames's voice cut through. This is not an attack on Mrs. Hale's character. It's about what's best for our children, for the town's reputation. We cannot encourage arrangements that— That what? Elias demanded. That show humanity? Mr. Harp struck the floor with his cane. Enough. This community must decide. Will you marry the woman? Yes or no? The hall erupted. Shocked gasps, whispers, even a few smirks hiding behind hands. Elias went still, not because he hadn't thought of it. He had, in quiet moments. In the way Margaret tucked Jimmy in with a tenderness that flickered through. The room like candlelight. In the way Hattie smiled again. In the way the cabin felt alive for the first time in years. But marriage, now forced, public? As if these men had claim over his private heart? No, Elias said firmly. I won't marry a woman because a room full of frightened people demand it. Warren frowned deeply. Then you must send her away. No. Then we must take measures, Warren said, voice cold. Elias Boone, the mine no longer requires your service. A wave of sound swept through the hall. Some shocked, some satisfied. You can't do that, Elias said. We just did, Mr. Harp replied. A man who defies the council, defies the stability of the town. No stable job, no stable household. The words were a sentence. Elias stood rooted, fury pressing against his ribs. But fury was no weapon here. He walked out. When he returned home, Hattie and Jimmy were drawing by the fire. Margaret rose the moment she saw his face. What happened? She whispered. Elias set his jaw. They fired me. Hattie's pencil dropped. Pa, it's all right, he said. But the words had no strength. Margaret's hands trembled. This is because of us. No, Elias replied. It's because of them. But Margaret stepped back, as if distance might shield him. I can't stay, she whispered. I won't destroy your life. You're not. You lost your job for us. I lost my job, Elias said, because they wanted obedience, and I won't give it. Margaret turned away, shoulders shaking. I need to leave before it gets worse. The words sliced through the room. Hattie cried instantly. No, you can't leave. Jimmy's my best friend. Jimmy clung to his mother's dress, tears spilling silently. Elias stepped forward. Margaret, look at me. She hesitated, then met his eyes. There is nothing worse than an empty house, Elias said. I lived in that cold long enough. I won't go back. Her voice cracked. They'll never forgive you. Maybe not, he said. Maybe forgiveness is overrated. What if things get ugly? She whispered. Then we'll stand together, Elias said. Not because anyone tells us to, but because we choose to. Margaret covered her face with both hands, a trembling surrender. Hattie threw her arms around her waist, Jimmy around her legs. Slowly, Margaret knelt, pulling the children close. Tears streaked her cheeks. Elias stood over them like a pillar. The cabin breathed with them, warm, alive, defiant. Outside, the storm began again, stronger this time. But inside, there was something sturdier than the walls, stronger than the rumors, louder than the voices in the hall. A family taking shape, not by blood, not by law, but by courage. And in Black Ridge Hollow, courage had always been the rarest thing of all. Spring didn't arrive in Black Ridge Hollow so much as it broke through, like a prisoner finally snapping their chains. The snow receded from the ridge a little each day, revealing patches of stubborn green fighting its way through the thaw. Thin streams formed where the frost melted, trickling down into the valley like the mountain itself was learning to breathe again. Inside Elias's cabin, life returned with the same slow, certain force. Jimmy laughed more. Hattie hummed every morning. Margaret moved with a calm that came from no longer waking afraid. Yet the shadow of the town's judgment lingered, dark as coal dust under fingernails. Elias worked odd jobs to keep food on the table, mending fences, hauling timber, repairing wagon wheels. Some folks paid him fair, others avoided him. Most stood somewhere in between, unsure whether to admire his defiance or fear it. But one thing remained constant. The cabin felt full, whole, alive. One evening in late April, Elias stood at the edge of the small garden outside the cabin, watching Margaret kneel among the seedlings. The air smelled of damp earth and budding pines. Hattie and Jimmy chased each other in circles, their laughter rising like a hymn. Margaret brushed dirt from her hands and looked up. "You're staring." Elias crossed his arms. "Just observing." "What's there to observe?" He didn't answer at first. He wasn't a man of many words. Grief had taken that from him once, but he felt something now he hadn't felt since Clara died. Something quiet, steady, dangerous. "You've made this place brighter," he said. Margaret paused. The wind lifted a lock of her hair. "I didn't do anything special." "You did enough." She looked away quickly, eyes glistening. Before either could speak again, the children barreled into Elias's side, breathless. "Papa!" Hattie squealed. "Tommy Granger said the church is doing a spring service. Can we go?" Jimmy nodded vigorously, like attending church might be the greatest adventure of his life. Elias hesitated. Last time he'd stepped into that sanctuary, the town had looked at him like an intruder in his own skin. But Hattie's eyes were bright, Jimmy's hopeful, and Margaret's expression was steady, though a flicker of nerves crossed it. "We'll all go," Elias finally said. When Sunday came, the walk into town felt like approaching a battlefield. Margaret held Jimmy's hand. Hattie walked between them. Elias kept his shoulders straight, jaw tight. The church doors creaked open. Heads turned instantly, every face registering the same shock, discomfort and something else, curiosity. No one moved to greet them. No one offered a nod or a touch of the hat. They were an island in a room full of people. Elias guided them down the center aisle to an empty pew near the front, not hiding, not asking permission. Hattie clung to Margaret's arm. Jimmy fidgeted, eyes wide. Reverend Ames climbed the pulpit, throat tight. His sermon was about renewal, forgiveness, the courage to rise from hardship. But every line felt aimed straight at them. At first he avoided their eyes. Then slowly his gaze drifted toward Elias. When the sermon ended, the congregation stirred with nervous energy. People whispered behind gloves. Mothers tugged their daughters close. Men cleared their throats but said nothing. Elias started to rise, but then old Mrs. Drumley, the midwife who'd seen every birth in Black Ridge Hollow for 40 years, stood up with effort. Her spine was bent, her voice gravelly, but when she spoke, it carried. "Decent folk," she said, "don't leave a woman and child in a storm. Decent folk don't punish a man for kindness." "We forgot that." The room stilled. Mr. Thompson, the wheelwright, pushed himself up next. "Boone helped my boy when he fell off the wagon last winter. Never asked nothing in return." A quiet ripple. Then another voice. And another. Small apologies. Awkward, halting, but real. Moved through the room like a breeze. But not everyone stood. Warren Larkin remained seated, jaw clenched. Mr. Harp shook his head, defiant as ever. A few families gathered their things and left without a word. Reverend Ames hesitated, then descended from the pulpit. He approached Elias, voice low. "I misjudged you." Elias didn't speak. Not out of anger, but out of the heaviness of the moment. The Reverend looked at Margaret then. "And you?"
I'm sorry.
Margaret swallowed hard and nodded. The children sensed something important had happened. Even if they didn't understand it. Hattie's face lit with relief. Jimmy finally uncurled his fingers from his mother's dress. By the time they stepped outside, the sun had warmed the church steps, melting the last stubborn patches of ice. A few townsfolk approached, offering cautious handshakes, awkward smiles, tentative welcomes. Not everyone came. Not everyone forgave, but some did, and for now that was enough. The weeks that followed brought a gentler rhythm. Elias built an addition on the cabin, a small extra room that Margaret and Jimmy could call their own. Wood shavings covered the ground like confetti. Jimmy helped hand nails. Hattie painted the window frame blue. "So the sky could stay close," she said. Men from town stopped by, offering tools or labor. Others offered nothing but silence, not hostile but wary. But the cabin was no longer an exile. It was part of the ridge again. And Margaret, she bloomed. She began mending clothes for townsfolk, charging just enough to keep dignity intact. Women who had once whispered began stopping by with torn hems and loose seams. Some still wouldn't make eye contact. Others lingered, offering recipes, stories, thin smiles. For the first time since arriving in the hollow, Margaret laughed. Not the quiet, polite laugh she'd given out of obligation, but a full sound. A sound that made Elias look up from his workbench every time. One warm evening, as fireflies pulsed over the grass, Elias finished hammering the last plank onto a new table, one wide enough for 6 people. He called everyone outside. Margaret gasped softly. "It's beautiful." Hattie stroked the wood grain like it was some rare treasure. Jimmy climbed onto the bench and declared it the best table in all of America. Elias rubbed the back of his neck, awkward. "Well, we needed one that fit everyone." Margaret's voice softened. "Everyone?" He looked at her then. Really looked. The fear she carried had faded, leaving behind something steadier, something familiar. "Everyone?" he said again. For a moment, time stood still. Long enough for the fireflies to dance between them like sparks from a forge. Margaret stepped closer. "Elias, this life you've given us, we don't deserve it." "No one said life was about deserving," he replied. "Sometimes it's just about choosing." Her breath trembled. "And what have you chosen?" "You," he said simply. "All of you." Margaret closed her eyes, a tear slipping down her cheek. Not from sorrow, but from release. The children barreled between them, shrieking with laughter, breaking the moment with the purity only children had. Margaret wiped her face quickly, smiling. Elias chuckled, something easy and warm. That night, they sat at the new table, all 4 of them, passing bread, telling stories, interrupting one another, spilling cups, laughing until the candle sputtered out. For the first time in years, Elias didn't think of Clara with pain. He thought of her with gratitude, because she'd taught him the kind of love that made him brave enough to open his door again. Summer settled into the valley like a promise fulfilled. The cabin walls were warm, the fields soft, the children loud. Margaret planted a small patch of lavender by the porch. Hattie declared it her new special corner. Jimmy learned to fish in the creek. Elias built shelves, chairs, a cradle he pretended wasn't a cradle. The town still had its divisions. Some folks held on to judgment like a badge. Others softened like earth after rain. But the cabin, the family, stood steady. Elias would sometimes step onto the porch at dusk, pipe in hand, watching Margaret read by the fire, the children curled against her. And he would feel something he thought he'd never feel again. Home, not the kind built from wood, the kind built from people. Chosen, fought for, earned. One night, as the stars ignited the sky, Margaret joined him on the porch. The air smelled of pine and lavender. "I've been thinking," she said. "Dangerous thing to do," he teased. She nudged him lightly. "I'm serious." "So am I." She took a breath. "We could make it official. Someday, if you wanted." Elias turned toward her, his expression softening like dawn. "Only if you want it too." Margaret looked back at the glow inside the cabin, where the children slept tangled like roots of the same tree. "I do," she whispered. Elias took her hand, a simple, steady gesture, not a proposal, Not a promise, just a truth finally spoken aloud. Inside, the children stirred. Outside, the mountain wind carried a soft warmth. Life wasn't perfect. The town wasn't fully healed. Their path would not be easy. But they had weathered a winter together. They had survived judgment together. And now, they would grow together. A family not born, but made. Elias squeezed Margaret's hand once, then let his thumb rest against her knuckles. Then someday, he said, we will. She leaned her head on his shoulder. Someday, and there, under the quiet sky of Black Ridge Hollow, someday felt closer than ever.